So we've been talking about how this process happened, this change happened, and why this change happened. This change, I've been saying, is probably the biggest change in the history of human life. Well, why do I think that's a realistic sentence? What is the result of it? What's very different in life between the gatherer-hunters and the farmers before 10, 12,000 years ago and after, for those who change over to it? One of the things that's really radical about it is that it's a one-way street. So why would that be? Why is it that farming, once you become a farmer, is something there's no going back? Yeah, Sarah?
You're essentially putting all of your eggs, all of your work in that one basket. And
yeah, you're putting all your eggs into one basket. And anything else? Yeah. Yeah, great. So it's these two keys are sort of the reason why this is a one-way street. And that difference from Abu Huraira 1 and Abu Huraira 2 really drives it home, right? Same place, same environment, but the difference is 10 times more people. Not 300 or 400 people, but 3,000 or 4,000 people living in the same settlement. The process of food production does sort of exactly what it's designed to do rather effectively. It raises the carrying capacity of that specific spot of ground. Instead of enough food to feed 300 people, if you just go out and gather what's there, if you farm it, if you control what's there, you can get enough food to feed 3,000 people out of that same amount of space. Once you've done that, though, you no longer have the time and the energy and the resources to do other things. And you also have this problem that you suddenly have 3,000 people to feed. And if you wanted to suddenly change your mind and say, you know what, there's some problems here, let's go back to gathering and hunting, what are you going to do with those other 2,700 people who are your cousins and your cousins' cousins? It's a problem. You don't have a good solution to that. So that increased carrying capacity acts as rather like a point of no return. Once you started farming, once that's become the main way you're getting your food, once you've raised the carrying capacity, there is no really practical way of lowering it. All right, another way that this really affected daily life. Once you have decided to become a farmer, once your family has sort of transitioned over probably several generations into farming as the main way you're getting your food, you've cleared your land, you've planted your crops, now what are you going to do? You going to eat them right away? No. You're going to have to sit around and stare at them, right? We've talked about watching, you can talk about watching paint dry. That sounds pretty boring. Have you ever tried watching a field of crops grow? That's also reasonably boring, I think. But if you're a farmer, it's pretty necessary. Once you've put your investment in, you've cleared the land, which is very difficult to do, and you've put the food in the ground, put the seeds in the ground, it's going to take a long time for that effort to pay off. And so you're not actually going to go anywhere. You have to stay in one place to protect your investment. And we refer to this as the rise of sedentism. Everyone says we all spend too much time watching TV and using our computers and sitting in boring archaeology classes, right? We are living too sedentary a lifestyle, right? Same word, same meaning. Staying in one place. We're not getting up and moving around in our daily lives, and in a broader sense, if you're a sedentary population, you're not getting up and moving around either. You're no longer roaming around looking for the next meal. You're staying in one place. So this has good sides and bad sides to it, right? You're going to have to stay there and defend your crop. You're going to have to stay there and protect all this investment you've put in. And that's not necessarily about being a bad person and not wanting to share. But we talk about increased carrying capacity. We're also still probably dealing, for most of human history, with carrying capacities that are really not much above the population that's relying on them. So most human beings, to radically overgeneralize, but I would say it's still fair to say that most human beings for most of our history have been at the brink of starvation almost their entire lives. You don't have a lot of excess floating around. And you've put in all this effort and energy to clear this land and to plant these seeds. Someone else comes in and tries to take it. That's going to be a really bad problem for you. Your family and you will be dead, whether they kill you or not, because you don't have anything to eat. And there's no place to go because all the land is more or less taken up. this is really where we start to get the idea of property. Now, that's a kind of a simplification, but you imagine a gatherer-hunter population, there may have been a sense that, this is my hill for this summer, that's your hill for this summer. If we're not getting along, let's just not cross this creek at the bottom, There's an idea of territory, there's an idea of separation and separate identities, but property is a little bit different. The distinction between, I have a deed that says this piece of land is mine and I can do whatever I want with it and it's mine forever. That's a new idea in human history, right? People didn't think about things like that until they started farming at the earliest. Probably in some ways they think about property differently after that as well compared to the way we think about it. But the idea that there is ownership of land, and we'll see some archaeological ideas connected to this in a little bit, is going to be introduced at about this time. Conflict also is probably going to take on a very different cast, right? It's not necessarily the same as when two gatherer-hunter groups didn't get along, banged into each other over a resource, and fought. Groups are now dealing with much more substantial settlements, and they've also got a lot more to lose. It's difficult to go and steal somebody's house, but you could certainly go in and attack a house, and that's something that you're as a person who built that house, you've got very little recourse besides defending it. All of your effort and energy is in one spot of ground on the land, and you can't take it with you anymore. Not traveling around has its upsides too. And that could be, more permanent housing, and in fact, just to sort of generalize, more stuff in general. A property that is owned by a gatherer-hunter group is going to be very small, very few things, mostly very light ones. You're not going to carry around a whole mud brick building when you move around the landscape and set your camp up in different places. When you start staying in one place and living there permanently, you're going to start having much more substantial buildings, much more substantial objects as part of your world. This is a sort of artist reconstruction on the top right of the screen here of a place called Çatalhöyük. We'll show the spelling of that in a slide later on. And the idea here, this is probably not actually supposed to be the whole thing. They just sort of stopped drawing at the edges here, but these houses, these buildings here were probably surrounded by more houses that looked a lot like them. They're made of mud brick, they're fully above the ground, and they're big. They're not something you can carry around. Another interesting thing about them, they're all sort of built up against each other. There's no streets, there's no walkways. If you want to get into these buildings, you climb up onto the roof and you enter through these rooftop holes here. Every different main door of the main building of each separate house would be on the ceiling. And we think that's actually partly as a result of defense. Where we have people who have a lot to lose at this spot, and they want to be able to protect what they've got, and they want to be able to protect it from anyone else who might come in and try to take it. And so their houses are very substantial, both because they don't have to travel around and because they can't. They have to stay and protect what they've got. You lose some things when you also don't move around the landscape. It used to be the case, if you were moving around regularly, you could include in your regular rounds certain resources that you don't have access to in other places. So perhaps you could get shell resources by going over towards the sea for a few months in a year. You could go to that certain volcano or mountain where you know that there was this wonderful volcanic stone used for making tools, and get access to that when you're there. If you're staying in one place permanently, you lose access to everything that isn't right around your village. And this is the first time we really have the beginnings of something we would call trade. That trade could take a lot of different forms. It would be down the line trade. The people who are living near the shell might trade to the people on the next valley over, who would trade to the people in the next valley over, who would trade to the people in the next valley over. Or maybe somebody would actually go around and take things from all this whole way, from where they are naturally occurring to where people have them in demand. That's a really different kind of interaction than human beings have ever had before. I mean, we've been one breeding population for hundreds of thousands of years, so it's not like people have never literally seen another human being outside their little group when they were hunter-gatherers, but they would see them relatively rarely. They would see them, relatively few of them. And when you're talking about settlements of 3,000 or 4,000 people, that tells you right there you're dealing with a pretty different daily life. You're also dealing with interactions with groups that are going to be the same group for the long term. The people in the next valley over are always going to be the people in the next valley over. The number of trades, the number of people trading, whether it's down the line trading or one person going all the way from where the resources are and bringing things back, is also going to be a different way of sharing not just things but ideas and information. People are going to actually communicate in a way that's pretty radically different, I think, than the way they did before, when they were just seeing one small hunter-gatherer band for a few weeks a year, and then the bands would separate and move off, and they wouldn't speak to each other or see other members of that group for a very long period of time. So we're talking about a different kind of set of interconnections are going on in these early farming communities. With new economies, new ways of getting the food that you need and the things you need to survive are going to be new technologies. We've got the development of something that archaeologists call groundstone. And I'll pass these around. They are real, so please do be very careful with them. They're unprovenienced museum collections, so we don't have, they're not sort of part of archaeological study collections. They're souvenirs that somebody picked up and that destroyed their archaeological value in a way that person probably didn't realize. A projectile point, probably a spear point, that is made with what we call chipstone technology. So this is the way people made all of their tools before that. And what I want you to feel, and don't test this out, is just sort of how kind of fragile this is. I mean, it's reasonably sharp. I mean, if you really tried, you could probably cut yourself. Please don't. But it also feels like if you were to drop it onto a nice concrete floor, it would probably shatter, right? So you can sort of take a look at that and send it around. And what you see later on, starting at the beginning of farming, is stuff that looks more like this. And I have a little video of it here playing. Groundstone technology is made not by taking two stones and smacking them into each other, but taking two stones and rubbing them on each other for a really, really, really long time. And you're going to end up with things that look like this. And I'll send it around. And when you hold it, again, please don't try not to drop it. But when you hold it, you kind of imagine that it's going to be a lot more durable. It's going to be a lot less prone to fragmentation because it's not made with a thing that is fragmenting it, right? All that stone on there that's been chipped off, you could chip off more with the same process. Grindstone technology creates something which is pretty different. And here the video is just sort of showing you that even though it just looks like a nice flat piece, you actually have something that's sharp enough to cut a piece of paper there. The video is obviously pretty substantially edited. That guy who was making that tool spent hours and hours and hours and hours and hours using those two stones in order to get that edge on it. But it's pretty effective, and you can use it in a way that is going to be hard to use a chipstone tool. Here, an example just to show you, yeah, you can use it to chop down a tree. The other thing you can do with it is actually use it to work the ground. And it's not going to break nearly as easily. It's going to be much more durable compared to those chipstone pieces, like the little one that's going around, which is obviously snapped in half, right, and becomes useless as soon as it's snapped in half. The blade on that adze gets dull. What are you going to do? You're going to sharpen it. Yeah, you go back to the creek, you've got water, you've got sand to sort of act as an abrasive. You start grinding it on that same spot that you were grinding it before, which has become a nice flat groundstone surface itself, really good for sharpening and honing edges. Here's another thing that is developed at this time, techniques for food storage. We don't really think about food storage that much. We stick it in the fridge, and then, after a couple of weeks, it smells bad, and so we throw it out. When you're dealing with people who are on the verge of starvation all the time, that's not going to be a possibility. And it's also, important when you think about the difference between the way food comes into your world when you're a farmer versus the way it comes into your world when you're a gatherer-hunter. If you're hungry and you're a gatherer-hunter, you go out and get some more. There isn't any more? Okay, you pick up and you move to the next valley over where there is some more. If you're a farmer, you sow your crops and you wait, right? Sedentism, you stay there. You mostly work on it, right? You don't just sit there and stare at it. You weed it, you water it, or you manage it. and then you protect it and you wait for it to grow. And then, all of a sudden, you get this huge amount of food, way more than you could ever eat, at one moment, or within a couple of weeks or a month. And then, nothing. So your life depends on making sure some of that food sticks around until, not just until spring, but until a whole year from then, when your next crop actually comes in, or the beginnings of the next crop coming in. So you need to actually figure out how to store your food. People have come up with remarkable ways of doing this, things that we wouldn't think actually would work, because none of us are familiar with how food actually sort of works particularly well. There's a story, I've got a quote here, I won't read it, but I'll just sort of summarize it, right out of the book called Mort's Relation, which is the text of the first couple of years of the Plymouth colony, the Pilgrims, right? They wrote a book about their first couple of years there and sent it back to England to be printed, and it describes what happened when they first arrived. They arrived to Cape Cod, and they got off the Mayflower, and they looked around, and one of the things they found was an area that looked like it had been recently dug up. And they decided that they could go and dig up whatever had just been buried there. And they discovered baskets and mats made of reeds, tightly woven together in the sand, filled with bushels and bushels of dried corn. Burying corn in the ground doesn't seem like a very good idea for us to keep it safe and preserve it. But the native peoples who were living in this area knew very well the properties of the baskets they were making, of the sand that they were putting it in, and they knew that the sand would drain the water from around it, and that the baskets would deflect most of the water off of it and keep that corn dry. And if it's dry, you've got an anaerobic environment, right? Little critters aren't going to be able to eat it. If it's covered in baskets and buried deep enough, bigger critters aren't going to be able to dig it up. It's actually a really good storage system. Of course, the problems encountered for the Pilgrims when they decided immediately to steal the corn, and that actually is one of the things that has led to some difficult relations over the last 400 years. The fact that the very first encounter with native peoples of this permanent settlement in this area was to immediately steal things. So native peoples. Thanks. Native peoples were familiar not just with the environment around them, why the eureka moment explanation for domestication is kind of silly, but they were familiar with the properties of the things that they're eating and how to keep them edible for long periods of time. I love this image of an old a farmer in Ireland who found this strange thing in his field. It's an image from 2011. There have been other examples of this. Remember we were talking about preservation, and I showed the image of the bog bodies, right? The Danish man, Toland man, who had been garroted, he had been strangled and tossed into a bog, and then archaeologists found him in the 19th century. Locals found him and gave him to archaeologists. He looked, 3,000 years old, and he looked like he could open his eyes almost, with his skin sort of tanned, but otherwise he was incredibly well preserved. Well, the people who lived in Ireland at this time, they knew what was going to happen when they put his body in there. They knew that things that go into the bogs don't rot, and they took advantage of that. This is from a period where they were already farmers, and they were pastoralists, and they lived primarily on cattle and cattle secondary products. And what you're seeing here is a hollowed out tree stump that was filled with butter and capped off and sealed up with pitch and put into a bog for storage. And I imagine, I'm not sure if anyone's tried this, but I imagine you could take some of that 3,000-year-old butter today and eat it and not die of food poisoning. It spent this whole time in an anaerobic environment. The butter is not got critters growing in it, and butter is itself invented as a way of preserving food, right? Butter, cheese, these things that we think about as sort of additions to like the fresh milk that we might have, there are ways that were developed for preserving these foods so you keep them over the long period of time.